If you struggle with your diet, society usually tells you it's a failure of discipline. We are taught that poor health and modern metabolic diseases happen because people simply lack the personal willpower to put the fork down. But to understand modern eating habits, we have to look past individual choices and examine our deep evolutionary history. This graphic illustrates what geneticists call the thrifty genotype. Notice the DNA double helix here, packed with food symbols. For most of human history, populations survived in harsh environments defined by brutal cycles of feast and famine. To survive starvation, the body developed a highly efficient biological function, maximizing insulin production to store fat rapidly when food was plentiful. We can see the resulting problem clearly in this evolutionary mismatch diagram. It maps out what happens when you take an ancient biological gear, built entirely to manage an environment of extreme scarcity, and drop it into a radically different modern landscape. The modern environment offers 24/7 access to high-fat, high-carbohydrate industrial foods. When you feed a constant stream of dense calories into a genetic machine designed to aggressively hoard energy, the output is metabolic breakdown, obesity, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. Our metabolic response to industrial food is an ancient survival mechanism, operating with perfect efficiency in a landscape it was never evolved to navigate. So, how did our daily environment change so drastically that it triggered this biological mismatch across the entire globe? It started with a massive shift away from the home kitchen. As we see in this vintage photograph of an early processing facility, society slowly began outsourcing the daily friction of hands-on cooking to industrial machinery. This diagram maps how outsourcing impacted habits. At the top, standardization of convenience foods caused a sharp decline in hands-on culinary skills. At the bottom, the consequence is generational disconnection. Younger populations are severed from cultural food contexts, leaving them dependent on quick commercial solutions. By removing the effort and cultural context of meal preparation, society created a landscape of friction-free calories, the ubiquitous bait required for our genetic trap. Access is governed by an economic layer Bourdieu called the taste of necessity. On the right, the working class prioritizes function over form, heavy, cost-effective food for caloric survival. This completely opposes the affluent taste of luxury, which prioritizes elaborate presentation and delicate flavors. To see how this economic theory plays out in a macro reality, look at this dietary data map of Malaysia. The call-out box confirms that white rice remains the undisputed daily staple, consumed twice a day by the vast majority of the population. However, when we isolate the data for the B40 demographic, the bottom 40% of earners, a stark dietary reality emerges. This chart shows over 68% of these adults rely heavily on cheap, sugar-sweetened beverages weekly. Because processed calories demand priority in tight budgets, a massive deficit follows. The dark mandating a reliance on the exact processed calories that our genetic code is evolved to hoard. This brings us to a rather grim conclusion about our modern food system. If we look at this Venn diagram mapping the intersection of biology, economics, and society, the text box reveals the ultimate irony. The avoidance of metabolic decline has now been transformed into a luxury commodity. This illustration shows how health itself has become the modern iteration of the taste of luxury. Only the affluent can afford the specialized diets, organic produce, and additive-free sourcing required to safely bypass our own biology. Fortunately, genetic predispositions do not guarantee metabolic disease. This graphic highlights a pathway out, based on Gary Paul Nabin's research. High-fiber traditional foods and slow-release carbohydrates realign our metabolic signaling, shielding the body from decline. But those inputs require stepping outside the industrial food chain. They rely on real-world, localized agricultural practices and hands-on cultivation that society outsourced decades ago. Solving the modern nutritional crisis requires a shift in perspective. We must stop treating diet as a failure of willpower and recognize the complex architecture. As the text on this plate makes clear, we eat what we eat because our biology set the trap, our social structures baited it, and economic disparity springs it.